Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are going to be revisiting some old faces. About 6 months ago I did a few videos looking at some of the Chinese vehicles that we find on the Chinese server in War Thunder, and I thought I'd revisit some of them, give a bit more context, because after looking back at those videos I'm not really happy with them. I feel like I missed out a lot, especially on the historical side and how these tanks would play in game, so therefore I thought why not go through them one by one in different videos and give you some more information and also what to expect from them. Now, if you want to download these user missions for yourself so you can test out the Chinese vehicles, because obviously they're not available to us on the international client, I've left a link in the description to MuhAbroomz, which is the guy who sorted out, all of these vehicles for us. On top of this, you will have to also download a link to the tank Polygon by Gilard. And as long as you do that, you're able to play around with these vehicles in the test drive. Now, also on top of this will be the only introduction that you get out of all of the videos, so if you are confused by any of the videos, or you see some people confused in the comments about what these videos are about, please point them towards this one so they can understand what's going on. So, today we're having a look at the Type 59. Now, a lot of people look at the Type 59 and just say, well, it's a copy of a T-54. Today, I'm going to go through why it's at least slightly different to the T-54 that you know in War Thunder, but is definitely similar to a separate one, which we may get in-game at some point. So, first of all, we have to talk about how it came about. Some people may be surprised, especially people who haven't really read a lot about Chinese history. China was not always a united nation, and they were also not always a powerhouse. Nowadays, you look at China and think about its industry, think about its economic power around the world. A lot of people have called it a peaceful rise to power because they haven't really had to fight too much in order to get to a level of nearly world hegemon where only really America stands in their way when it comes to their power. And this wasn't always the case. Before 1949, before, the Mao era, as it's known, China was very divided and was actually struggling with some of its neighbours. Japan would invade it from time to time, taking quite a lot of land, especially if you have a look at pre-World War II for Japan. And it's definitely an interesting history to go into, but I won't really go into that part. For me, I'm interested in the Type 59. So, if we have a look in the early 1950s. So, what two big events happened in the early 1950s? Well, first of all, you had Mao Zedong. Now, if you don't know who Mao Zedong is, he was the leader of the People's Republic of China, which was established in 1949/1950, depending on who you ask. Basically, Mao proclaimed it to be established in 1949, so that is, when it is said to be. Now, the government carried out mass executions of landowners. They instituted collectivization, basically straight-up communism in China. But one thing that this did do was unite it under one banner, becoming the People's Republic of China. Now, I'm not going to go in whether this is wrong or whether this is right. I'm just giving you the history here. So on top of this, around about the same time of Mao Zedong setting up his new government and also the establishment of the People's Republic of China, in 1950, guess what happened? Yes, the Korean War. Kim Il-sung, his North Korean forces, they crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Now, because of this, the United Nations got involved, helped out the South Koreans, because obviously what Kim Il-sung wanted to do was take over the whole of Korea, make it his own area, basically, make it all of his, and the UN forces didn't want that. The US also got involved on the southern side, and the Soviets were technically involved on the northern side by supplying munitions and stuff like this. Basically, on one side you had what was seen as an active part of what was brewing to become a world war, a Cold War. At the end of World War II, you had two major powers. You had America, and then you had the USSR. At that time, they kind of stared off in Berlin, I think is the easiest way of saying it, after World War II. Then came along the Chinese with their social revolution. So you had three major powers, but the Chinese one was growing. It was not at the level of the Soviets or the Americans, and this was the first battle where the Americans got involved, where the Soviets got involved on either side, and then the Chinese eventually got involved on the side of the North. This is why a lot of people may talk about the relationship between, China and North Korea being positive. Well, it's because of things like this. Now, what came out of this for the People's Republic of China? Well, they first of all realized that they were, let's just say under-equipped. The one thing that they had was manpower, but when it came to machinery, when it came to munitions, when it came to motorization, let's just say it wasn't the best. All they had really was some grizzling war veterans from some of the Japanese campaigns which had happened earlier on, but mainly the problem they had was they were coming up against less forces in the form of the UN and the American side, but they were getting annihilated because they didn't have any modern weaponry. So, as a nation would do when they are left in this situation, the Chinese decided it was time to upgrade. So this is where stuff like the Type 59 comes in. So during the People's Republic of China getting involved in the Korean War, they were able to acquire tanks from the Soviet Union under what was called the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty. This meant that the Chinese at the time were given a bunch of World War II era Soviet tanks. We're talking IS-2s, we're talking T-34-85s, and also various assault guns along with that. So this was their main armaments. Now remember, at the time, the Americans had much surpassed this idea, and therefore they were definitely fighting at a disadvantage on the Chinese side. This was shown. It wasn't good enough. Simple as that. So, because of this, with the People's Republic of China growing in power, realizing how much manpower they actually had, what they wanted to do was create their own. And who can blame them? Instead of trying to buy off other nations, why not just create it yourself? And that is where this tank comes in. So, they wanted to have their own production capabilities, and they also wanted more modern tanks. So in 1955, they received their first T-54s and T-54As, and the Chinese military leadership negotiated with the Soviets to acquire blueprints and assembly know-how of these machines. Now, this is the key bit. Generally, when a nation exports a tank, what they don't do is then go and send over a bunch of engineers or go and give them the blueprints to also build them themselves. And this is what the Soviets did for China. So a lot of people see the Soviets having a large hand in China's rise to power. And at least from a production point of view, when it comes to militarily, yes, I would agree. So the first Republic of China's tank factory, it was called the Inner Mongolian Machinery Factory number 617, which is a mouthful. This was set up in 1956. Basically, a bunch of Soviet helpers or assistants or engineers went over and helped and sorted it out. And it was able to produce its first T-54A in 1958 with Soviet parts. So this was still not a homegrown machine, but it was built in a Chinese factory. The Chinese built T-54A design was officially adopted into the PLA service in 1959, and hence then it became the Type 59. So technically, this tank is of Soviet design. It is also of Soviet parts, but it is also Chinese because it was built in China. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. Do you label it as a Chinese tank, or do you label it as a Soviet tank? You got to remember, the basic Type 59, the one that you see in this video, it served for almost 2 decades with very little modification. So this was not just, we're going to try it for a few years, and then, we're just going to scrap it. No, this was a mainstay in the Chinese arms for their, their Chinese mechanization arms of their military. And it even fought in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and it also later, later fought Vietnam during the Sino-Vietnamese in 1979. I think I've got that wrong. Anyway, it fought in the Vietnam War, I think is the best way of putting it. And it was very much like a lot of Soviet designs, and I suppose even American. When you look at the M60, you have the M60, M60A1, the AOS, the A2 was even tried, the A3, which, is still around. And on top of this, then eventually you create the XM1, and then the M1, which eventually, becomes the Abrams, and the Abrams that we know today. And because of this, with the Type 59, they kind of had the same process as something like an M60 or even something like a T-34 or a T-80. They kept upgrading it over and over and over again instead of going for a newer design such as the Type 69, just because, well, it's cheaper. One of the problems with having to create a new vehicle is you set up a whole... What would it be called? You set up a whole factory to produce one certain vehicle, and then you have to swap that whole factory onto another vehicle. It takes time, it takes pressure, and sometimes it's not worth it, because it also costs more money. So a lot of people are like, no, there's not really much point in this. But anyway, one of the things that I talked about there was that it was based off a T-54A, pretty much a Chinese-built copy of a T-54A. We don't have a T-54A in-game, so what is a T-54A? Well, a T-54A is an interesting machine. Take a T-54. So we have 3 of them in-game. It's a pretty decent machine. It has a 100mm gun on it. It's quite nippy in its own little way. But what the difference was with the A variant is the A variant had a gun stabilizer. It had the STP-1 Gorizont vertical plane gun stabilizer. And this added to the D10T, which is the 100mm main gun that you find on the T-54s in-game, and it now is called the D10TG. And it had a fume extractor on it, eventually, and it was also given an OPVT wading snorkel, the TSH-2A22 telescopic sight, a TVN-1 infrared driver's periscope, an IR headlight, and a new radio. It also had a multi-stage engine air filter, radiator controls for improved engine performance, an electrical oil pump, bilge pump, and automatic fire extinguisher, and extra fuel tanks. So this was an upgrade to the T-54. Now, if we talk about it in game standards, what does this translate to? Well, it translates to a stabilizer for said gun. Now, some of the documents that I've read about the Type 59 say that the early variants of the Type 59 did not have a stabilizer, or at least the first ones that were built, but I've also read other documents which said they all had a stabilizer. What the main thing is the one that you're looking at right now on the Chinese server has a stabilizer. And what this means is if it comes to game, it will have a stabilizer. So you have a 100mm gun on something that resembles a T-54, and it's stabilized. Another thing to note as well about this Type 59 tank is even though it may look very well armoured, from looking at various different models and looking at various different things, it seems to have less armor than the T-54s that we have in game. Now, I don't know whether that is, when it comes to the game itself, whether that is something that's going to be translated, or if they're just going to have a very similar model to the T-54, but what I see out of this is a slightly more lightweight, slightly more acceleration heavy, stabilized T-54. And what we see from the T-54s is they're pretty good. At least the first one when it comes to its turret and its upper glacis being bouncy. The last two, they're still very good at bouncing shots. The only issue is the turret is not as strong. And what I see from the Type 59 is a copy of the later tier Type 54s we have, or the third version, such as the 51, but with a stabilizer. So this gives us an interesting conundrum, because it can technically fire the same ammo that the T-54 can, but it's slightly faster and has a stabilizer. Doesn't have, dual track or anything like that, or, it doesn't have the turning capabilities, but it is a little bit faster. So where do we put this at a BR? For me, when something has a bit more speed, when it has, a better engine, when it is able to go a little bit quicker with a stabilizer, that means it should go up in BR. So instead of being 7-7, I can see this as an 8-0. It can pen the weak spots of a chieftain. If it gets up-tiered into 9-0, yes, it's going to struggle. But against the majority of armor packages that it fights, it should be okay as long as you aim. The gun itself, with its HE filler, does a lot of damage once you pen. So the main concentration with a machine like this is going to be working out where to penetrate a machine. A lot of guns, such as the British guns, it's more about shooting it in the correct place to try and get the damage down. Doesn't really matter where, it doesn't really matter, you know, when it comes to penetration for those guns, but what matters is where you hit it. For the Type 59, it's going to be just penetrating and letting the round do the rest. We all have played the T-54s, or we have all have played the APC-BC, APHE that the Soviets have to offer. You all know that when it penetrates, it does a lot of damage. There's no difference with this Type 59, it does exactly the same thing. Another thing to note is that it has a Type 54 12.7mm on the top. This is an exact copy of a Dishka, so, you know, you're seeing it in game. It's exactly the same. No difference at all. But for me, this, even though a lot of people look at this and think, well, this is just a copy of a Soviet vehicle. Well, first of all, it's a copy of a Soviet vehicle we don't have in game. Second of all, to me, it's an interesting vehicle. A lot of people enjoy the T-54s. I would love to have a stabilized one. And it is Chinese. I know a lot of people are going to argue that it is a Soviet tank. Fair enough. You can take that argument. My argument is it was used by China for 20 years. It was built by China. Yes, at the start they had a bit of help from the Soviets, but overall it is a Chinese born and bred tank. And therefore, if we ever get a Chinese tech tree, it should definitely be in it. This is one of the tanks I'm looking forward to, along with some of the more modernized versions of the Chinese tanks, which hopefully will eventually come to game. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.